Hello, everybody. Um, we are coming here together, I guess, because we are all deeply affected in whichever way, we are deeply affected by the current situation in Ukraine and Russia and Europe and the rest of the world. And I had a very strong impulse to put this talk on today. On the one hand, the first part of our talk, I will just simply speak about the effects of trauma and collective trauma and the current situation and how every one of us can use some tools and practices personally. I will speak about personal, relational, and collective tools and practices that can help us in this time. But I want to speak as well about the legacy that we have from a long history of wars and conflicts in Europe. I mean, the entire world, but we keep it for today in Europe. And for the second part here on the Zoom, we will also have some sharings and voices, and we will presence that together. Before we start, I invite you and everyone that's listening right now, because it's a very strong time. It might affect us strongly, and I want us to pay attention for a moment to what's our inner state. Everybody has an inner experience right now. That's how you feel about the situation, and how you feel about the situation has a physical dimension. In your physical body, you might be very stressed or relaxed or tight or very closed or open. So we just take a moment to see, how do I feel right now as I'm coming into this talk, in my body, emotionally. How am I affected emotionally? And not to forget that sometimes we are so affected emotionally that we can't feel anything anymore because we are too overloaded. That's very valid too. It's just good that I'm aware of it. My mind might be racing. My mind might be calm. And then just for a moment to look, how have you been affected in the last 2 weeks by the situation, by the fact that there is again a war in Europe. And since many of us here have roots in Europe through the history of the 20th century until now, we are all connected to the current events. So we might go through stronger emotional triggers and experiences. And we do need a practice. If we don't want to suppress all of it, then we do need to have a practice. And I want to speak about this practice now. And at the end of this live talk, we will do another practice to round up our talk today. So the last 20 years, I was traveling around the world, and especially in the last 10 years, speaking a lot about the impacts of trauma, but in specifically about collective trauma. Because working with the tremendous after effects of the Second World War and the Holocaust in Europe, in Germany, in Israel, we have seen how deep are the wounds that are undigested. Even if we think it's long time ago, we see that generations are struggling through the after effects of massive violence and wars. And And I think that the current situation, we saw it already through the COVID pandemic. We see it now, and we are going to see it massively through climate change, that it's absolutely necessary to work on the collective restoration that our culture needs to go through. And so in the current situation, I might be personally very affected. So I want to speak a bit about different things we can do right now from the I perspective, the relational perspective, and the we perspective. On the individual level, I might go through, when I saw the invasion of the Ukraine, I felt a tremendous shock. I woke up in the morning and I felt a very strange feeling in my body. I looked at the news and I saw the news and I felt it's a tremendous shock, an invasion of a country. Whatever are the roots, I will speak about this in a moment. It affected me very strongly. So I needed a practice how to be with the inner experience that I was going through, and in order to not suppress it, but to digest it. But since many of us have roots, if we grew up in Germany or in Austria, many of our grandfathers fought a terrible war in Russia and caused a lot of traumatization. So we are inherently connected to the war that is happening right now. Within the collective unconscious, there's a large-scale trauma field that connects all of us. And so the emotions, the feelings, and even the distance and the shutdown and saying, no, this is everything too much for me, which is a very valid thing to say, is part of my current experience that I can bring awareness to. So there, in this moment, when we see many people suffering, we might immediately want to look, okay, what can I do? And that's very important, because whatever is in the sphere of my influence to do, to support refugees, to donate money, to donate work, to support an NGO, even if I don't know what to do, I can look around and say, okay, what are the things that I can support? Or maybe many people have ideas themselves, so we can do something. But at the same time, the inner experience that we are going through is not an obstacle on the way, it's part of the way. That's very important, because for many people it seems like what I'm going through, I need to suppress in order to be able to act. And what I'm saying, no, our inner experience is valid because it's connected to the collective trauma field. And it's part of the trauma that has often been transmitted to us through our ancestors, through our grandparents and parents or great-grandparents. And it's still alive in us. So we need to take that seriously without drowning in it. And then I want to speak a little bit about, for everybody who is maybe newer to the subject, when we talk about trauma, we talk about overwhelming effects, overwhelming experiences that I cannot compute, or overwhelming pain that I cannot experience. And I split my reality into, there's a lot of stress, and there's so much stress and pain that I need to shut it down. And once it's shut down, it's becoming numb. So many of us might feel, when I watch the news, I feel simply numb. I feel distant. I cannot take it. And that's a valid experience. That's not a mistake. And that's also not that something is wrong with me. Or there might be a lot of stress and reactivity. That doesn't mean that something is wrong with me. That just means that the current experience is touching a much deeper trauma in me. And once I know, for some people, once we know that that's not a mistake, but that's something that we need to have practices and tools or relationships to process that. So that brings me to the second part, that having supportive relationships where we can speak about these things. We invite friends, we come together, we exchange, we have even professional support to process what's coming up in us. When we go into relation, the power of our nervous system, the power of real caring listening in this time is very important. Caring listening helps other people that we listen to share, but also to co-regulate, two nervous systems that co-regulate stress and can take each other into a more relaxed capacity, so where we can really go into problem solving. And so human relation is one of the best remedies in strongly overwhelming or traumatizing situations. And listening and sharing is very powerful. The third part is the collective. The collective has an interior and the collective has an exterior. The collective exterior is what we see at the moment when many people come together to support the situation. And that's what we can do. We support the collective support system, rescue system, all kinds of physical needs that need to be met. We can contribute to that. At the same time, what we do now is the collective interior. We create spaces where we witness each other. We have witnessing and digesting spaces in the collective space that help us to digest collective experiences. And I believe that since it's not yet mainstream knowledge how deep collective trauma sits in our societies, I believe every country needs to have it written in the foundations of the country that we need to have restorative processes. Like in the last 30 years, we needed to do much more work on the collective healing than we did. And I think what's happening right now is like the red alarm bell, because like a war like we see today in Ukraine is something that built itself over many years. It built itself out of the collective numbness and absencing that led up to various decisions that have been taken that escalated the situation until what we see today. And so now, since it's so escalated, we have to take care of the most vital needs and the most vital security. That's true. At the same time, we have to put measures in place in order to deal with the collective trauma that leads up to it. Because we are saying, and I think individually, many people are saying that too, this is how I should do it, or this how we can do it. But then we look at our life, and how we really live differs kind of from how we should do it. So the idea that I have in my mind how life should look like doesn't fully match the way I live. So I can't walk my talk. And when we look at society, what do we see in society? We see two different kinds of processes. We see emergent, relational, creative, innovative, and warm processes. Processes where we feel connected, where we feel related, where we feel with one another. At the same time, when we look at society, and it looks like the same, it looks like that's society and that's happening now. But the second part is non-emergent, repetitive, disrelated, distant and cold processes that are predictable and that happen psychically over and over again. We do know these cyclic processes from our own individual lives, conflicts that we have over and over again, internal patterns, external relationship patterns that we have over and over again. And when we look back in history, we see the repetition of those recurrent patterns arising as recurrent wars, recurrent conflicts, and also recurrent collective patterns. And I believe we have to stop calling this as one society. Recurrent patterns are living in the past. When we look at, many people say, like history lies behind us. It's the past. I would say no. History is not the past. History is integrated. History is presence. Hundreds of thousands of years of life led up to this moment. It's sitting in all of us. Everybody who is listening right now, me who is speaking right now, and when you are speaking hundreds of thousands of years of history. Integrated history is presence. But unintegrated history, history that was too much to experience, history that was too painful, that has been split off and postponed, or today we call it trauma. That history is the past. That history creates separation. That history creates us versus them. So the unintegrated history that is deeply embedded in many processes in our society, these processes are not living now. They are hostages of time, but they affect us now. That's very important. And I believe we need a much higher discernment in order to be able to discern these two kinds of processes and know how to take care of it. And sometimes, since we all grew up in collective trauma, when our parents or our grandparents or our great-grandparents were in the First World War or the Second World War and the Cold War and any kind of massive collective trauma that our society went through, we grew up in the water that had the quality of trauma everywhere. And that's why we normalized it. Not because we're good or bad, but we normalize trauma. We say, this is how life is. The conflicts happen again and again, even in our individual lives. There are certain conflicts and arguments that are coming back psychically. And that's why we have to create a much higher recognition of that. That's not how life is. That's how life is when it's hurt. And once we name the real thing, we can also take care of the real thing. And that's why I believe when we come here today, and we are all very affected by the current situation in Europe and in Ukraine and Russia, we need to create spaces, collective spaces, where we create the right environment. Healing and integration means that we are able to create the right environment to integrate experience. What does it mean to integrate experience? It means learning. When we integrate our experiences, we learn. When we integrate trauma, we learn. In the permafrost of Europe, in the trauma layer throughout entire Europe, there are many, many pearls of ethical learning that are still frozen. Imagine there is ice. Within the ice, there are the unrestored wounds, the unrestored ethical relational hurts. The Holocaust is a huge unrestored ethical wound that hasn't been restored yet. And by melting the trauma layers, we eventually come to the restoration of the relation. We come to the place of the original transgression. And we have to integrate that original transgression and harvest its pearl as post-traumatic learning. Because otherwise, if we don't take care of the frozen pearls of ethical learning that we still didn't harvest, we don't know how to deal with artificial intelligence. We don't know how to deal with nuclear weapons. We don't know how to deal with genetic engineering, because we don't have the ethical refinement that we need for the current innovative process. And that's why that collective trauma healing starts with the experiences that come up in us when we see the current situation, when we feel the current situation, when many of us are affected by the current situation. That's the beginning of the activation of collective trauma. So many people are very disturbed, very activated, very much afraid, very numb, or very angry, because that's the collective trauma that comes up in us. And we need spaces to digest it, because if not, we're going to suppress it. And if we suppress it, we fuel the current conflict. If we learn to integrate it, we, in a way, take our shares out of the collective trauma field. And since trauma creates absence means numbness. Absence means not feeling. Absence means that I can't feel you. I can feel you some, but I can't feel you fully. I can feel a situation some, where I can't feel it at all. And in the absence, the escalation of, or the recurrence of conflict is building itself. We saw it in the last 30 years, between the Western countries and Russia. There is a lot of numbness because of the collective trauma fields, and it led up to an escalation that leads to the current conflict. And that's why I believe we are called to learn and study collective integration processes, East-Western Europe integration processes, because the former East and the former West of Europe hasn't been integrated yet. There hasn't been a proper integration process that integrates Europe into a new Europe that we don't know. Why? Because we want to learn from each other. I grew up in Vienna. Somebody that grew up in the former East Germany, I don't know that experience. I need to learn from that experience in order to create integration. And other people can learn from my experience. But if there is not a mutual learning, we just put the two together. But there's a fracture running throughout Europe. And in many other parts of the world too. Colonialism left a lot of fractures in whole Latin America, in Africa, in many other places. So to learn the art of integration in order to create integrated, more resilient cultures that can participate in the collective collaboration that we need in this moment, in order to deal with this current conflict, to deal with the threat of climate change, we have to have a different global collaboration. So the global immune system is the resonance capacity in every one of us, and the capacity to deal with the reactive aspects that we might feel right now, that are the residues of how collective trauma lives in us individually, as personal trauma, ancestral trauma, and so on. So the global immune system is where we all feel activated to contribute until maybe one day the entire world will stand up when we see a conflict somewhere in the world and respond. And the more of us really respond, the more power we have to, on the one hand, practically take care of a conflict, but also not even let it come there. Because we break down the cycles of recurrence before they become manifest. So that's why I believe we all have a chance. We all have a chance to harvest the power first, right now, to come together and help solve the situation as one world. But while we do that, and after, to have a drastic change in how we relate to the residue and the restoration that didn't happen yet. And I think that's our calling. We are living in the time when we create more resilient cultures because of integration processes. We become resilient in order to deal with global challenges. And what I would love to do now is to lead us for a moment into a meditation where we are here, thousands of people that come together because this is really important for us. We are coming together because we are all part of it. It's not just happening over there. We are all part of the current situation. And I would love us to create a collective resonance field where we presence and we see what's our own inner experience. And we do it together as thousands of people from most probably all over the world that are sitting here right now. And we are contemporary witnesses. We are here to witness, and because we feel, we can respond. Because we feel, we can respond. And so let's take a moment again and say, okay, let's have these words first drop in a bit more and see what resonates with you, what resonates less, and even what's your connection to the current conflict between Ukraine and Russia. If you allow yourself to also really have the feelings that you have, or allow yourself to say, yes, what I experience is really too much for me in the last days, and I feel overwhelmed, and we bring compassion to that too. And you can start again with taking a couple of deeper breaths. And remember, your body is not just 30, 40, 60, 80, 90 years old. Your body is part of a long lineage of life, a long lineage of the tradition of living. So many of your ancestors went through hardship, went through restoration, healing, disruption, for us to be sitting here with all the achievements and also all the struggle that hasn't been integrated yet. but with all the achievements and the wisdom that life handed over to us. And so when you feel your body, you're actually feeling the wisdom of that evolution of life. And that wisdom is present in your physical body. And that makes you part of the global immune system. That makes you part of life that feels care, that wants to respond, that can give, and be generous. At the same time, your body also gives a home to your emotions. And that it's valid that you feel the emotions that you feel, or the emotional overwhelm that you feel. And at the same time, we can bring awareness to the experience and discern reactivity and responsiveness, or response ability, my ability to respond. And then also see out of the space that you can create in yourself that allows you to digest your own experience and to integrate your own experience that you're having here day after day after day. It's an inner art. It's an inner skill set. It's a competence building. I can reflect, digest, and integrate my experience in order to be able to respond. I can develop the capacity to put myself into the shoes of everyone connected, even if it's hard, even if polarization is easier. I can develop the capacity to take perspective, bring space to my experience and to other people's experience. And enter a mutual space of collaboration and contribution. Trauma is based on scarcity. In trauma, there's always a lack of something. That's why in crisis, we need generosity. If in crisis the solution is hard to see, we can see at least the next step. And we can take the next step. And then see the next step. And like this, we create a path. So we need responsibility, generosity, and the next step. So what is the next step in the current crisis for you? What can you do or contribute as your next step? And whatever is in your field of influence, it doesn't matter how small is the step. If you feel there's only a small influence, or how big is your step because by life blessed you with a big radius of influence. But we all can give something. And together we are an orchestra. Through giving, we are creating collective coherence. Giving is generous. Trauma creates scarcity. Hospitality, generosity, and participation become remedies in times of crisis. And the last thing, it's easy to participate in fragmentation. It's much harder to create inclusion and coherence. How can we every day create a little bit more coherence and integrate fragmentation? And then take a couple of deeper breaths. Feel your body well.